I'm 36 years old, and 11 months ago I buried my father, lost my marriage in the same season, and found out my own sister had drained everything he left behind before I even had the chance to grieve him properly. I was folding laundry in a one-bedroom apartment with my 2 kids asleep on an air mattress in the next room when I opened an email from a title company asking me to confirm my move-out date from a house I didn't know had been sold. My house, my father's house, the house he promised me in front of a lawyer 18 months before he died. I sat on the floor of that apartment with a laundry basket still in my lap, and I read that email 4 times before the words made any sense. And by the time they did, my hands were shaking so hard I had to set my phone down on the carpet just to keep reading it. What my sister did to get that house is bad enough. What she did after I found out is the part that's going to make you put your phone down and just stare at the wall for a second. And what happened to her 3 weeks later, that's the part I think about every single night before I fall asleep, because I didn't do it. I didn't have to. If you've ever been the one who shows up, who carries the weight, who gets called strong right before someone takes advantage of exactly that, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because the woman who thought she'd gotten away with it made one mistake, and that mistake is the reason I'm sitting here telling you this instead of still sleeping on an air mattress. Drop a comment and tell me the moment you realized someone in your family had been counting on your silence. And don't forget to subscribe, because next week's story might be the one that sounds exactly like your life. Let me take you back to where this actually starts, because you need to understand who I was before that email, or none of what happened next will make sense. I grew up in Millbrook, a small town about 40 minutes outside Richmond, in a brick ranch house my father built with his own hands the year before I was born. My dad, Walter Doyle, was a machinist for 31 years at the same plant, the kind of man who fixed his own truck, coached Little League on weekends, and never once raised his voice in anger that I can remember. My mother died when I was 19 and my sister Priya was 16. And from that day forward, something in our house shifted in a way neither of us fully understood until years later. I was the one who stepped up. I deferred college for a year to help my dad manage the house, the bills, and a teenage sister who was grieving in ways that looked a lot like acting out. Priya skipped school. She stayed out late. She ran through boyfriends who never lasted and jobs she never kept, and every single time something went wrong in her life, it was me who got the phone call, not our father, because Dad, God love him, could not say no to her, and he knew I would handle it so he didn't have to feel the guilt of refusing. That pattern set itself in stone before either of us turned 25, and it never once broke. I got married at 24 to a good, steady man named Marcus, and we had our son Eli, and 3 years later our daughter Wren, and I built a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like the stable thing I'd always wanted. Priya, meanwhile, moved to Charlotte, then back to Millbrook, then to Charlotte again, chasing a series of men and a series of business ideas that all required startup capital she didn't have. Capital that somehow, every single time, ended up coming from our father's retirement account. I watched it happen for years and said almost nothing, because saying something felt like starting a war I didn't have the energy to fight, and because my father would always meet my concern with the same tired sentence. She just needs a little more time to find her footing, Renata. Not everyone finds their way as fast as you did. I used to hear that sentence as a compliment. It took me a long time to understand it was actually an excuse, one he used on both of us, to let her keep taking and to let me keep quiet. When my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 4 years ago, everything sped up in a way that still feels like it happened in a single week, even though it stretched across 11 brutal months. I was the one who drove him to every appointment. I was the one who sat with him through 6 rounds of chemo, who learned to manage his medications, who slept in a recliner beside his hospital bed more nights than I can count, all while raising 2 young kids and working a full-time job as a claims adjuster that I somehow never once missed a deadline for. Priya visited when she could, which was not often, and always left before the hard parts. The parts where he was sick from the treatment or too tired to talk or scared in a way he never let anyone see except me, late at night, when it was just the two of us and the hum of a hospital monitor. About 18 months before he died, on a clear afternoon when he was having a good week, my father asked me to drive him to his attorney's office in town, a small practice run by a man named Elliot Frazier, who had handled Doyle family paperwork since before I was born. In that office, my father sat across a desk from Mr. Frazier and told him plainly that the house, the land it sat on, and the bulk of his savings were to go to me, because I was the one who had shown up, and because he wanted his grandchildren to grow up with the roof he built over their heads. He said Priya would receive his truck and a modest sum in cash, enough to help her get on her feet, but not the house. I remember sitting in that waiting room afterward, and my father took my hand in the parking lot and said something I have replayed in my mind every single day since he died. "You held this family together when I couldn't, Paya. That house is yours. I'm putting it in writing so nobody can argue with it later, not even me if I get confused near the end." He called me Paya. It was his nickname for me since I was a little girl, and it's the last thing I think about most nights. I want to be honest with you, because this story only works if I am. I did not think about that will very often in the months after. I wasn't caring for my father because of what he'd leave me. I was caring for him because he was my father and he was dying and I loved him. But that piece of paper mattered more than I understood at the time, because it turns out my sister knew about it too, and knowing about it is exactly what set everything else in motion. My father passed away on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with my hand in his and Priya, to her credit, on the other side of the bed. I will give her that. She was there at the very end, even if she hadn't been there for most of what came before it. For about 6 weeks after the funeral, things were quiet in the specific, exhausting way grief makes everything quiet. I was drowning in probate paperwork, insurance forms, and a marriage that had already been cracking under years of financial stress and exhaustion, though I didn't know yet just how badly it was about to break. 3 months after we buried my father, Marcus told me he'd been unhappy for years and that he was moving in with someone he'd met through work. I won't dwell on that part of the story because it isn't the one you're here for, but I need you to understand the timeline, because it matters. Within 4 months of losing my father, I had also lost my marriage, and I was suddenly a single mother of a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, working full-time, trying to keep 2 grieving children steady while I could barely stand upright myself. I moved out of the marital home because Marcus wanted to buy me out and I needed cash fast, and I told myself the plan was simple. I'd rent a small apartment for 6 months while probate finished, and then Eli, Ren, and I would move into my father's house, the house I'd been promised, the house where I'd grown up, the house with the tire swing my dad had hung in the maple tree the year I turned 7. That plan was the one thing keeping me upright through that entire year. Every night in that cramped apartment, I would tell my kids, "Soon we'll be in Grandpa's house, you'll have your own rooms, there's a whole yard to run in, just a little longer." I trusted my sister to handle certain pieces of the estate paperwork during that stretch, because she had, without my full understanding of what it meant, been added as a co-executor alongside me on some earlier draft of documents, something my father had done years before the final will was drawn up, and something neither Priya nor I had ever formally corrected. I was buried in work, in single parenthood, in grief, and I let her tell me she was handling the small administrative things, the utility transfers, the property tax paperwork, so I wouldn't have to. I trusted her. That's the part that still makes my chest hurt when I say it out loud. I trusted her because she was my sister, and because some small, stupid, hopeful part of me still believed that losing our father might finally be the thing that made her show up the way I always had for her. Instead, while I was working 60-hour weeks and raising 2 kids alone in an apartment with paper-thin walls, my sister was quietly using an outdated power of attorney document, one my father had signed years earlier during a hospital stay when he briefly needed help managing bills and had never formally revoked, to list our father's house for sale. She used it to open a discussion with a real estate agent. She used it to sign preliminary paperwork. And 3 weeks before I got that email from the title company, she used it to accept an offer and move toward closing on the house that was, in writing, in my father's own final will, mine. I found out by accident the way you find out about most. Betrayals, not through a confession, but through a piece of paperwork that was never supposed to reach you. That title company email was routine, a formality asking the current resident, meaning me, according to their outdated file, to confirm a move-out date ahead of a scheduled closing. I called the number on the email, with my hands shaking so badly, I had to set the phone down on speaker, just to dial correctly. The woman on the other end was kind, and confused why I was confused, and she read off a seller's name to confirm she had the right property. Priya Doyle Ashford, acting under power of attorney for the estate of Walter Doyle. I sat on that apartment floor, and I did not cry. I want you to understand that, because everyone expects the betrayed sister to fall apart on the spot, and I didn't. Something in me went very still and very cold, the exact same stillness I imagine soldiers describe when the adrenaline shows up before the fear does. I thanked the woman for her time. I hung up. And then I sat there on the floor of that apartment, laundry basket still in my lap, and I let myself feel exactly one thing before I moved into action, and that one thing was not sadness. It was clarity. I picked up my phone again, and I called Elliot Frazier, my father's attorney, the man who had drawn up that final will in that quiet office 18 months before my father died. Mr. Frazier is 71 years old, precise in the way only old-fashioned country lawyers are precise, and when I explained what had happened, there was a long pause on the line before he spoke. "Renata," he said, "that power of attorney expired the moment your father passed away. It has no legal standing whatsoever over a probate estate. If she used it to sell that house, she committed fraud, plain and simple, and I intend to make sure everyone involved understands that immediately. I want you to sit with that word for a second the way I had to. Fraud, not a misunderstanding, not a family disagreement over what Dad really wanted. Fraud, spoken by the one man in this whole story with no reason to take my side except that the paperwork simply said so. Mr. Frazier asked me not to contact Priya directly, not yet, because he wanted to build the paper trail properly before she had any warning that I knew. That was the hardest thing I have ever done, sitting on that information for 4 days while my sister texted me twice about nothing in particular, once asking how the kids were doing and once sending a laughing emoji about a meme, as if she hadn't just tried to sell the roof out from under my children. I did not respond with anger. I responded the way I always respond, calm, brief, ordinary, because I needed her to have no idea what was coming. While I waited, Mr. Frazier pulled everything. The original will, filed and notarized, the outdated power of attorney document and its exact expiration terms under state law. The real estate listing paperwork, which, in her haste and her confidence that no one would ever check, Priya had signed using her own name paired with the words acting under power of attorney, a phrase that, once the estate had already opened probate under my name as executor, was not just outdated but legally void. He also pulled something I didn't even know existed, bank records showing that $11,000 had already been transferred out of my father's estate checking account into an account under Priya's name in the 2 months after his death. Money she had access to only because that same expired power of attorney document was still linked to the account, and no one had thought to formally close it the moment probate opened. $11,000. While I was working overtime shifts and stretching grocery money across 2 kids in a 1-bedroom apartment, my sister had already been quietly draining our father's account and moving toward selling his house, all while sending me laughing emojis about memes. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think some of you already know the answer in your own life. Have you ever found out that while you were the one drowning, someone close to you was quietly taking the exact thing that was supposed to be your lifeline? Sit with that question, because it's about to get worse before it gets better. I need to back up for a moment and tell you about a conversation I'd almost completely forgotten until Mr. Frazier's investigator brought it up. Because in hindsight, it was the first thread I should have pulled, and I let it slip right past me the way you let a lot of things slip past you when you're running on 4 hours of sleep and a diet of vending machine coffee. About 2 months after my father's funeral, Priya had called me late one night, sounding upbeat in a way that felt strange for someone supposedly still grieving, and she asked, almost casually, whether I'd mind if she handled the utility transfers and the property tax paperwork on the house sink. I was so slammed with the kids and work. I remember feeling a small, guilty flush of gratitude in that moment, the first time in years she'd offered to take something off my plate instead of adding to it, and I told her that would be a huge help. Thank you, genuinely thank you, because I was drowning and any hand reaching toward me looked like rescue. What I didn't know then, and what the investigator later confirmed through email records Mr. Frazier subpoenaed from the county assessor's office, was that this offer wasn't kindness at all, it was reconnaissance, a way to get her name attached to the property file so that, when she approached a real estate agent 6 weeks later, she'd have paperwork trail that made her look, on paper, like someone with legitimate standing to act on the house's behalf. She had also, it turned out, contacted the real estate agent, a woman named Colette Rourke, nearly 5 weeks before that title company email ever reached me, and in her very first message to Colette, according to records later produced in Discovery, she wrote that her sister was overwhelmed with 2 young kids and would probably be relieved to have the house handled quickly and quietly. Reading that line for the first time, sitting in Mr. Frazier's office with a manila folder of printed emails in front of me, was worse in some ways than finding out about the money, because it wasn't just theft, it was theft dressed up as generosity, planned around the specific shape of my exhaustion, built on the assumption that a woman drowning in grief and single motherhood would be too tired to ever look up and notice. I sat in that office chair and I read my sister's own words describing me as someone she could count on to be too overwhelmed to pay attention, and something in me that had spent 36 years giving her the benefit of the doubt finally, quietly, permanently closed. Mr. Frazier let me sit with that for a minute before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was gentler than the situation probably called for. The voice of a man who had clearly seen this exact story play out in other families more times than he cared to count. Renata, he said, the people who take advantage of reliable people almost always do it by using the very same reliability against them. She wasn't wrong that you were overwhelmed. She was just counting on it in a way no sister should ever count on anything. I drove home that night with the folder on the passenger seat, and I picked my kids up from my neighbor's house, and I made them dinner, and I put them to bed. And only after their door was closed did I sit down at my kitchen table and let myself cry the way I hadn't let myself cry since the day my father died, not because I'd lost the house. The court had already made clear I wouldn't, but because I'd finally let myself fully see the shape of what my sister was actually willing to do to me. On day 5, Mr. Frazier filed an emergency motion with the probate court to freeze the sale and formally revoke any authority tied to the expired power of attorney. And he sent a certified letter to the title company halting the closing that had been scheduled for the following week. He also, at my request, sent Priya formal legal notice of what he had discovered, because I wanted her to hear it from paperwork before she heard it from me, the exact same way I had. She called me 40 minutes after that letter would have arrived at her apartment in Charlotte, and I let it ring 3 times before I answered, the way I always answer now, calm on purpose, because calm was the only weapon I had left and I intended to use it well. "Renata, what is this?" she said, her voice already climbing toward that particular pitch I remembered from childhood, the one she used whenever she was caught and needed to get ahead of it before anyone else could speak. I told her I knew everything. The listing, the $11,000, the power of attorney that expired the day Dad died. I said it in a flat, even voice, the same voice I use at work when I'm denying an insurance claim that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. She didn't apologize. I need you to sit with that too, because it matters for everything that comes after. She did not say I'm sorry, not once, not that day, and not for a long time afterward. Instead, she said, Dad would have wanted me to have something too, Renata. You already had the marriage, the kids, the stable job. I needed this more than you did. I told her that Dad had already decided what she needed, a truck and a cash sum, in writing, with a lawyer, while he was of sound mind, and that deciding she deserved more because her life felt harder was not her call to make, especially not through fraud. She hung up on me, and for the next several days, my phone filled up with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in months, aunts and cousins who had apparently gotten a very different version of events from Priya, one where I was He greedy older sister trying to punish her for grieving differently, one where the will was somehow unclear, one where I was, in her words to our Aunt Diane, trying to erase her from the family the same way I'd always tried to make everything about me. I did not respond to any of it publicly. I let Mr. Frazier's paperwork do what paperwork does, which is sit there being true whether anyone wants to believe it or not. My Aunt Diane, my father's younger sister, called me directly instead of just forwarding Priya's version along like the others had, and I will always be grateful to her for that one small act of actually asking instead of assuming. "Renata, tell me your side," she said, no accusation in her voice, just an old woman who had loved my father and wanted to understand what had actually happened to the house he built. So I told her everything, plainly, without embellishment, the way I'd tell a claims adjuster reviewing a file, because that is simply how my brain works after 13 years in that industry. The will, the expired power of attorney, the $11,000, the listing agent contacted 5 weeks before I ever found out. There was a long silence on the line when I finished, and then Diane said something that stuck with me for weeks afterward. "Your father used to tell me you were the one who'd hold this family together long after he was gone, and I used to think that was a compliment he was giving you." Listening to this, I think it might have also been a warning he was giving the rest of us, and none of us listened. Diane became, in the months that followed, one of the only relatives who stood firmly and publicly in my corner, correcting the narrative whenever it came up at family gatherings I no longer attended, and quietly letting me know, every few weeks, that people were slowly starting to understand what had actually happened, even if Priya never once corrected the record herself. Not everyone came around. My cousin Marcus, no relation to my ex-husband, just an unfortunate shared name, stayed firmly in Priya's corner the entire time, posting vague, pointed comments on social media about family members who cared more about money than blood. Comments I understood were aimed at me even though he never used my name. I stopped engaging with that side of the family almost entirely, not out of spite, but because I simply didn't have the emotional bandwidth left to defend myself to people who had already decided which story they wanted to believe before they'd heard a single fact. Here's where I have to tell you about the part of this story that still gives me chills, because I did not orchestrate what happened next, and for a long time I genuinely believed it was simply a coincidence, until I understood it wasn't a coincidence at all. It was the natural, inevitable end of a pattern my sister had been running for years, one that finally caught up with her all at once, in the same 3-week window. While Mr. Frazier's motion was working its way through probate court, and while the title company was quietly notifying the prospective buyers that the sale was void due to fraudulent authority, Priya was also, unrelated to any of this, in the middle of launching what was going to be her 4th business attempt in 6 years, a boutique event planning company she had named, with what I can only assume was zero self-awareness, legacy events. She had used part of that $11,000 from our father's account, along with a small business loan she had personally guaranteed, to put down a deposit on a storefront lease in Charlotte, and to pay a deposit to a wedding client for a very large, very public spring wedding she had booked as her flagship event, the one she was using to build her whole portfolio and her whole reputation in a city where she was still trying to establish herself. That wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks after I found that title company email. When probate court froze the estate account as part of the fraud investigation Mr. Frazier had filed, it didn't just freeze the house sale. It froze every account linked to that same outdated power of attorney authority, including, it turned out, a joint account Priya had foolishly used to commingle some of that stolen estate money with her new business's operating funds, because she hadn't bothered to keep the money separate, certain no one would ever look closely enough to notice. Her business account was frozen 8 days before that flagship wedding. She could not pay her final vendor balances. She could not pay her rental deposit on the linens and the tent she had promised the bride. She could not pay the catering company the remaining balance they were legally owed under contract. The wedding, the one she had built her entire new reputation around, in a city full of exactly the kind of word-of-mouth clientele a boutique event company depends on to survive, fell apart 4 days before the ceremony, when the caterer pulled out publicly, in a scathing review posted where the bride's entire wedding party could see it, describing a company that had taken a deposit and then vanished on payment obligations. The bride, understandably devastated, posted her own account of the entire collapse in 3 separate wedding planning groups on social media, complete with screenshots of unanswered texts and bounced payment confirmations. And by the time it had circulated fully, Legacy Events was finished before it had planned a single successful wedding. I found out about all of this not from Priya, who had gone completely silent, but from our cousin Danielle, who sent me a screenshot with the caption, "Is this Priya's company?" And I sat there staring at a stranger's furious wedding post, describing my sister in words I never once said myself. Unreliable, dishonest, took our money and disappeared. I felt something complicated in that moment, and I want to be honest about it instead of pretending. I felt something simpler and cleaner. I did not feel triumph exactly. I felt the strange, flat recognition of watching a pattern finally run its full course in front of an audience big enough that it couldn't be talked away this time. For years, my sister had gotten away with taking things that weren't fully hers: money from our father, patience from our family, forgiveness she never once had to earn, because the people around her, mainly me and my father, kept quietly absorbing the cost, so the consequences never landed anywhere near her. The very same week that karma, or plain financial gravity, whichever word you prefer, caught up with her business, is the exact same week Mr. Frazier's fraud motion resulted in the probate court formally ruling in my favor, invalidating the attempted sale entirely, ordering the full $11,000 returned to the estate from whatever accounts it could be traced to, and issuing a report that was referred, given the scale and clarity of the fraud, to the county prosecutor's office for review of criminal charges. I did not ask for criminal charges. I want to be honest about that too. When Mr. Frazier told me the case would be reviewed for potential prosecution, my first instinct was actually to ask if there was a way to avoid that, because whatever she'd done, she was still my sister, and some small, stubborn part of me still didn't want to watch her go to jail. He told me gently that this decision was no longer mine to make, that once fraud involving an estate crosses a certain dollar threshold, the state itself takes an interest regardless of what the family wants, and that my job now was simply to protect what my father had left for me and my children, and let the legal system do what it was built to do. I moved into my father's house, my house, 6 weeks after that ruling, on a bright Saturday morning in early June, with Eli and Ren racing each other across the front yard toward the same maple tree that still, somehow, had the rusted chain from that old tire swing hanging from its lowest branch. I stood in that doorway with a moving box in my arms, and I cried for the first time since this entire ordeal began, not from sadness, but from something that felt more like relief, finally being allowed to exist after months of having no room for it. Priya was formally charged 3 months later, with 2 counts of financial exploitation of an estate and 1 count of forgery related to the power of attorney paperwork she had signed and dated in a way that misrepresented its active status to the title company. She reached a plea agreement rather than go to trial, which meant probation, a formal restitution order requiring her to repay the full $11,000 plus court costs, and a permanent record that, as it turns out, follows you in ways that are very hard to talk your way around when you're trying to rebuild a business that depends entirely on trust. I want to tell you what happened at the one and only conversation Priya and I have had since all of this settled, because I think it says more than anything else I could tell you about who she really is underneath the parts of her I used to excuse. She called me 4 months after the plea agreement, not to apologize, but to ask if I would consider writing a letter to the court describing our relationship in a more sympathetic light, something that might help her during her probation review, since I was, in her words, the only person whose opinion actually mattered to a judge. I told her no. Not out of cruelty, and not out of revenge, but because I finally understood something it took me 36 years to learn, which is that protecting someone from the consequences of what they've done is not the same thing as loving them, no matter how many years you've spent confusing the two. She hasn't spoken to me since that call, and I've made a kind of uneasy peace with that silence, the same way you make peace with a wound that's healed over but never fully disappears. My father is buried in the small cemetery behind the Methodist Church on Route 9, under a plain granite headstone that simply reads Walter Doyle, beloved Father, steady hand. I visit him most Sundays now with Eli and Wren, and I sit on the grass beside that stone and I tell him, quietly, that we're in the house, that the tire swing is still there, that I finally understand what he meant that day in the parking lot when he told me the house was mine so nobody could argue with it later. He was right. Somebody did argue with it. And the paper he insisted on, the one small act of foresight from a dying man who understood his family better than any of us wanted to admit, is the exact reason my children have a yard to run in tonight instead of a landlord's rental agreement. I think about the version of myself who sat on that apartment floor with a laundry basket in her lap, reading an email 4 times because the words wouldn't settle into anything that made sense. And I want to tell her something, so I'm going to tell you instead, because maybe you need to hear it too. Being the reliable one does not mean you have to keep absorbing what other people refuse to carry. Showing up for your family does not obligate you to stay quiet when someone in that same family decides your steadiness is something to be exploited instead of respected. I spent over a decade believing that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping my family together. And it took losing a father, a marriage, and almost a house in the same brutal year to teach me that peace built on my own silence was never really peace at all. It was just me, alone, holding weight nobody else wanted to carry. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Read the paperwork. Ask the questions. Trust your instincts when something about a sibling's sudden helpfulness with the boring administrative parts of a loss feels just slightly off, because sometimes it's nothing, and sometimes it's everything. That's my story. A house, a will, and a sister who thought grief would keep me too tired to notice. If this reminded you to check on something you've been avoiding, an old document, an account you haven't looked at in months, take that as your sign and do it today. Eli asked me last week, while we were hanging a new tire on that same old maple tree because the original rope had finally worn through, whether Aunt Priya was ever going to visit us in the new house, and I told him the truth, gently, the way you tell an 8-year-old something true without handing him more weight than he can carry. I told him some grown-ups have to learn hard lessons before they're ready to be close to people again, and that it isn't his job to fix that. It's just his job to grow up safe and happy in a house his grandfather built for exactly that reason. He nodded like that made sense, the way kids do when they're not quite sure it does but trust you anyway, and then he ran off toward the swing, and I stood there in the yard for a minute just watching him go. Thinking about how strange it is that the very thing my sister tried to take from us is the thing that ended up teaching my children what it actually looks like when someone finally stops absorbing the cost of someone else's choices. If you know someone who has always been cast as the strong one in their family, the one everyone assumes will just handle it, share this with them. Drop a comment, tell me if you'd have written that letter to the judge or not, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.